the background rationale that supports an association between MS and venous obstruction. This is what we have to start at the beginning, and I'll just go briefly through some of it. There are kind of three pillars that we sort of stand on, and each one is sort of sequentially led the development of understanding of the other. The first is historical, and that's the understanding that all MS plaques are venocentric. It doesn't necessarily mean, it's just a statement, and that's true. And no matter what the cause of MS or the numerous multi-factors that influence it, the lesions are venocentric. That's undeniable. There's no real, I think, contention or debate about that. And let's talk some about that. What do we mean by venocentric? Well, we basically mean that the lesions are often seen around veins, and we can see this with imaging, we can see it histologically, often periventricular where there's a higher vein density. And around the veins there's this cuff, and this cuff is similar to the appearance that's noted in other chronic venous diseases, either in the liver or in the legs, etc. And this is the first person who actually made that observation. And these were hand drawings made by Rindfleisch, and he said if one looks carefully at freshly altered parts of the white matter, one perceives already with the naked eye a red point or line in the middle of each individual focus, the lumen of a small vessel engorged with blood. All this leads us to search for the primary cause of this disease in an alteration of individual vessels and their ramifications. All vessels running inside the foci, but also those which traverse the immediately surrounding but still intact parenchyma, are in a state of characteristic chronic inflammation. This takes us to someone who did live in Boston, and then once he was thrown out, he went to LA. He was at Boston City Hospital, a neurosurgeon named Tracy Putnam, and his claim to fame in the MS world is that he would inject oily substances into the torcula, or into the confluence of veins in the back, and to see what happened. And he basically said that the similarity between such lesions that were developed in these dogs, many of these seen in cases of multiple sclerosis in man, is so striking that the conclusion appears that almost inevitable that venular obstruction is the essential, immediate antecedent to the formation of typical sclerotic plaques. Well, that sounds great if you believe Tracy Putnam, but in his day, obviously, as I said, nobody believed him. This was his description, and many neuropathologists said it was sort of hogwash, but you can see that this idea is not really terribly new. And again, especially the idea that these plaques are venocentric. Okay, so that's a given, and there's not much argument there. The other thing that's kind of a given is that in MS there has to be a breakdown or a loss of the integrity of the blood-brain barrier. Now, the blood-brain barrier is a concept that many people, even in medicine, kind of struggle with. Is this kind of nebulous blood-brain barrier? What's so different? Well, it is the lining of the blood vessels in the brain are different than the rest of the body. It protects the brain, so the brain is basically immunologically privileged. It doesn't see all the other stuff that the rest of the body sees. The junctions between the endothelial cells are so tight that it blocks out any transmigration of things from the vascular system into the brain. The idea is that if you have laminar flow, that's basic, steady state, fast flow, you basically are promoting low inflammatory states. But when you have disturbed flow, chaotic flow, reverse flow, stagnant flow, that promotes inflammation. And what happens are, just by virtue of the sort of stagnant nature of the flow where it's not going fast, cells tend to demarginize. They go off to the side, and they stick, sort of like Velcro or spaghetti on the wall, to the wall of the blood vessel. And these inflammatory cells then alter the blood-brain barrier. How do they do that? Well, they release things, such as adhesion molecules, such as oxidative stress. We end up with these cells, and this is known recently from Germany, that these cells, once they stick, they actually are capable of rolling against the blood flow along that endothelial lining or that blood-brain barrier until they find a vulnerable crevice where they can sort of take root, and then they sort of disgorge whatever contents they have that are inflammatory and allow these cells to then migrate across the blood-brain barrier into the formerly immunologically privileged brain tissue. And here we have this wall. And the wall looks nice and smooth and impenetrable, but actually it does have some little crevices. has opportunities for these white cells to sneak through and to cross over across the wall. And once they get across the wall, bad things happen. What is the imaging data from ultrasound, venography, and MR in support of this association between venous obstruction and multiple sclerosis? So, we know the lesions are venocentric. We know that the blood-brain barrier is involved. We've put out a theory of why venous obstruction could seemingly be involved in the inflammatory response of the blood-brain barrier to promote this loss or breach in the integrity. But it was really Dr. Zamboni, who you've all heard of, who actually was the first to actually think about the extracranial veins. That the obstruction might not actually be within the skull, but it could be lower down, more central. And you would still get the same effect of obstruction. Okay? And that's this idea that we talked about, last pillar here, that extracranial venous obstruction. And I personally believe, and a lot of people talk about, well, this is due to some embryogenic problem or it's due to something else. I think it's multifactorial, just like MS is multifactorial. The common thread that we're on is venous obstruction. The site is immaterial, as long as it's something that's going to cause the same flow pattern disruption upstream. And the cause, it could be anything. It could be a valve, which could be embryogenic. It could be post-inflammatory, such as mono, where the lymphadenitis inflammation kind of went towards the venous drains, toward the venous sheath, etc. It could be bony. It could be due to the carotid artery. It could be due to all sorts of things. And I'm not going to give you a laundry list, but I think it's important to understand that, at least in my view, venous obstruction is like a promoter for MS, like many other things, the promoters, all familiar with all the things that have been implicated in MS, from diet to post-viral exposure history to your genetic immune makeup, all these different things. I think why people are sort of excited so much about CCSVI is because that promoter is reversible. Those other things, you sort of got. And there's not a lot you can do about reversing what happened. But the venous disease can be reversed, and it can be treated. Okay? This is just an example of color Doppler, which is one, again, of the real, I think, sentinel modalities that's used today to diagnose CCSVI. That is the internal jugular on the right side, and the common carotid in red, jugular in blue. Yin-yang, that's what it should be. However, on the left side, you see the common carotid in red, and these colors are flow direction coded, so when they're the same color, they're going the same way. When they're red and blue, they're going in opposite directions, and all the arrows are pointing to this little tiny jugular vein, which is also red. Let me just show you a few results. This is a group of patients we did, and you can see that we did patients up to EDSS of 8. So we initially wanted to see everyone we could and try and understand who might benefit. And we had about, if you looked at the veins treated, an average mean of about almost 2 veins treated per patient. If we looked at EDSS versus number of vessels treated, it's not a great correlation, but you can see in general there's a trend towards the more veins treated, meaning the more disease, the higher the EDSS. Let's look at fatigue. This is one thing, and it's kind of, I shudder, and it's a little embarrassing because it's patient reported, and so there's a big opportunity for potential placebo. But if you look at the patients here and you look at the MFIS, Modified Fatigue Impact Score, as you know, the worst score you could get is 80. You answer these questions about how fatigue is affecting your life, and we're looking at the pre-op. So what I'm saying, if you looked at actually primary progressive, relapsing, remitting, secondary progressive, no matter where you started on the MFIS, at 2 months you basically cut in half. But that could all be placebo. I'm constantly reminded that MS is the poster child of placebo. We have seen change in Lita status at 1 year post-treatment. Basically, we not see anyone actually, we've seen one patient who had slight prominence of existing lesions, and that was somewhat concerning. We've seen no one have new lesions, which is kind of remarkable. Let's look at the fatigue. Again, 2 months, 1 year, this is all comers. If you look at relapsing remitting, this is kind of interesting. The relapsing remitting started with a mean MFIS of 52 or so, cut it in half, but at 1 year, they're continuing to go down. That's in contradistinction to the secondary progressives and the primary progressives, who initially had some improvement, but at 1 year had given some of it back, okay? That's just our group. It's a small, this is only 3 patients in primary progressive.